Welcome to the Mark Matousek Media podcast series. On this edition of the podcast, Mark talks with writer and teacher Adyashanti. Adyashanti is an American-born spiritual teacher devoted to serving the awakening of all beings. His teachings are an open invitation to stop, inquire, and recognize what is true and liberating at the core of all existence. He is the author of The Way of Liberation, Falling into Grace, True Meditation, and Resurrecting Jesus, embodying the spirit of a revolutionary mystic. Mark talked to him about the enlightened mind and how Christianity has lost its way. Now, here's Mark.
Hello, Mark. This is Adya.
Hi, Adya. How are you?
I'm doing very, very well. How are you doing?
Just fine, thank you. Well, Adya, I'm really enjoying your book, The Resurrecting Jesus.
Thank you. I really had fun, really enjoyed doing that book. It was really kind of a labor of love.
It's terrific. I mean, I've been to several of your retreats, and I would not have thought you would be writing a book about Jesus. It really surprised me.
I probably wouldn't have thought of it either, at least a few years ago. I mean, the last 2 or 3 years I've been doing one retreat a year that's sort of focused on Jesus' teaching, so I think it was kind of a natural outgrowth of doing that for the last few years.
Oh, I didn't know that. So tell me, first, why did you choose to emphasize the revolutionary Jesus?
Well, I suppose because that's one of the Jesus' characteristics that really speaks to me quite a bit, and even before that, it really came out during my 20s when I was really involved in Zen Buddhism, and I went through this period of getting very involved in the Christian mystics because I was looking for something that I didn't even know that I was looking for. I wasn't finding something in my Zen practice, and I just started to gravitate towards all these Christian mystics. Later, I realized what I was looking for was really the opening of the spiritual heart. I didn't know that at the time, however. So I read a lot, lots and lots and lots of Christian mystics and even did some of the practices they were doing. And later, after that period, sort of in my late 20s, I actually got around to reading entirely through the Gospels and the New Testament, which, believe it or not, I hadn't read all the way through them. And the first sort of thought that I had was I didn't even recognize the Jesus that was in those Gospels. I literally thought, who's this guy? I've never heard of this guy before. Because he came off to me as so sort of revolutionary in the sense of he was very, very outspoken about lots of issues of his day, the power structure of his own religion and politics and sort of any position of power and abuse. So he was very, very outspoken, and he was also very, very, very much a man of the world, which stands in kind of contrast to the typical Eastern sage that is the iconic image is somewhat removed from the world. And I think it even stands contrary to the image I had of Jesus. I think that we grow up as this sort of, God-man that's almost entirely transcendent of everything, and then you read the Gospels and you find out that he wasn't. He was a very, very in-the-world kind of person that had, on top of that, he had some very human characteristics. And to that, I really saw that this was a very revolutionary character, again, sort of in contrast to some of the sages that we get from India and China and Japan from the East. He was very, very vocal and very, very outspoken. That really stood out to me when I read through the Gospels, and it really intrigued me.
Was there or is there a conflict for you between Buddhism, which doesn't believe in God, and Christianity?
Well, I think you can look at that at least a couple of different ways. One way is from a theological perspective. There's obviously some very great differences. I don't think those differences necessarily have to clash because we all sort of have our own way of interpreting and packaging and speaking about our experience. I think that to some extent describes some of the differences between the two religions, but personally I don't find a conflict for them all because I look at these things in sort of a big sort of view. I don't look at them in a really through a tight theological lens, and I think they both are representations of almost archetypal spiritual patterns within us. Obviously, the Buddha, the seated Buddha, is sort of the archetypal image of transcendent realization. that which was never touched by time and the world and really any kind of human difficulty. And that's a very real part of spiritual awakened experience. And I think the Jesus story is an archetype of something quite complementary, but also quite different, which is a very, very engaged realization. The Jesus story, Jesus doesn't find his freedom through a transcendence of the world, and certainly not through any kind of removal from a world, but from a very, very deep engagement. And I think it all starts at the beginning of even the way we talk about realization. You know, in the East, you wake up. And I'm not talking from a theological perspective in Christianity, because that's very different, but in the story itself, the very opening scene where the Spirit of Heaven descends upon Jesus, to me, that signifies although complementary, very different kind of spiritual awakening. It's literally the descent of spirit rather than the spirit waking up and out of form. It's spirit descending down and into form. And I think these are very distinct perspectives that we can realize. I think they're both very legitimate, and they both part of, I think, really being awake in a whole way, you know, a way that embraces the wholeness of our experience, you know, what's transcendent and also what's very much part of our humanity.
I guess the core of my question was the difference between duality and non-duality. And you're saying that duality and non-duality are complementary approaches to enlightenment.
Sure. I mean, there's obviously fundamental differences. I mean, the dualistic perspective, and which is very much part of our Western spiritual traditions, the Semitic traditions, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, which aims at achieving a relationship with the divine, where in the East, the non-dual traditions are aiming at an identity, an identification with or as the divine. And so these are very different kinds of realizations. I don't really look at them the way most people do. I don't look at these, especially in the non-dual world, I don't look at these hierarchical sense at all. I look at them as within our human consciousness, we can have an experience of a union with God where God still has an otherness, and we also have a potential within our consciousness to experience ourselves to be the divine itself. And these are just potentials within our human consciousness. And what I have found, of course, circles in which I move in, it attracts a lot of people who are interested in non-duality, even though I don't tend to try to use that word these days because it's so loaded. But I attract a lot of people that are interested in non-duality. The fascinating thing that I see is that a significant number of the folks that are really into non-duality, for some of them, you know, of course, non-duality is very, very powerful, potent kind of teaching to induce a non-dual experience of awakening. But even in non-dual circles, more often than not, what's induced through non-dual teachings isn't actually a non-dual spiritual experience. What I mean by that is often what people realize in non-dual teachings, at least their initial realization, is the realization sort of like that they realize that they are pure awareness or pure consciousness, as opposed to everything else, to the world of form, to mind, to body, to emotion, to all of that. And that's not really a non-dual experience, of course. I call it actually a radical form of non-duality. You just get duality down to two things. There's awareness or consciousness and everything that arises within awareness. That's dualistic to the core, but at least you get the world down to two things instead of, you know, a billion different things. And that's because the non-dual teachings are really good at inducing that kind of realization. It's not complete and it's not non-dual. That may come later, where they realize that consciousness or awareness and whatever arises within consciousness or awareness are actually one thing, one whole, that there's not really consciousness and what arises within consciousness is two things, that the seer and the seen are one thing. But a lot of people that engage in non-duality, maybe they visited that and it didn't stay with them, or they haven't got that piece yet. So that's one part of non-duality that, you know, sometimes non-duality ends up to be more dualistic than it's, you know, or that what people gather from it is more dualistic than what it's frequently advertised as. And I think a lot of times in the non-dual circles, sometimes what's missing is the spiritual heart. because you can have an extraordinary amount of transcendent realization without the spiritual heart, which is really a deep form of intuitive, intimate connectedness, with life around you, that you can miss that. It's not the fault of non-duality. The teachings are profound and pure and beautiful. It's just, we often don't get the full realization all at one time. And what I found, I'm often utilizing different sort of teachings from different traditions, and what I'm really interested in, what works for a particular person, what they need at that moment. And sometimes people do need a real awakening of the heart, or the non-dual teachings gave them this very transcendent experience, but they still have a lot of unresolved emotion. It can actually leave them very disconnected from life, from human relationship and all that. And oftentimes when I introduce parts of the Jesus story and the very sort of notion, the very idea that there is a very legitimate and profound kind of spiritual realization that is about spirit metaphorically descending into matter, into humanity, into everything that one would wake up from, I found that when people, it helps them kind of grok what this other quality of realization can be through a story or through an image. They kind of get like, oh, there might be a bigger picture here for me, and maybe a significant part of the puzzle that they hadn't seen before.
That makes a lot of sense, and actually leads to my next question. In the book, you say that the search for the historical Jesus isn't the point, that the point is the story, the collective dream. What can we gain by rediscovering the power of the collective dream, the power of myth?
Yeah, I love that question because, as you know from reading the book, I think it's something that we have in large part lost contact with, the power of story. In the West, if you say to someone, oh, that's a myth, you're basically telling them that's not true, where that's a complete misunderstanding of what myth actually is. Myth is a story that's meant to convey something that can't be put in ordinary language. And so when we look at like the Jesus story mythologically, and completely don't even worry about how much is true, if some of it's true, if none of it's true, if it's a combination of both, it doesn't really matter. If we can look at it through the eyes of myth, then I think we can enter into the story in a very creative sort of relationship. And instead of asking what did or didn't happen or what Jesus really said or didn't say, we can start to ask ourselves, what does this story evoke in me? Because that's what myth's supposed to do. It's supposed to evoke actual realities. It's supposed to evoke hidden dimensions of human consciousness. And I think the Jesus story, as is the Buddha story and other religious stories, but they're very powerful at evoking very, very deep, often hidden dimensions of consciousness. And that's, I think, when we start to look at the Jesus story in that way, it becomes much more powerful. And I've had a lot of people over the years, when I've touched upon the story, remark how healing it is. Because a lot of people in our culture come away from their upbringing in Christianity, and some of them it really works for, and there's other people it really doesn't work for because it was too dogmatic for them to be able to really relate to. Yes, you can just throw it all out because it didn't work for you, but you can also look at the story with a totally different set of eyes, and it may actually have something to show you. To say nothing of the fact that we've all, you and I, and anybody that's grown up in the West, we've grown up in a culture that's absolutely dripping and saturated with this story, right? Even if you reject it, and even though a lot of the, churches in West, certainly in Europe and to some extent here, are closing their doors, still this story has an immense influence on the Western psyche. And if we can't come to peace, real peace, with that story, it becomes, it's sort of like a wound that doesn't heal.
Oh, the wound of Christianity.
The wound of how we've understood Christianity, of how some people have engaged in Christianity. I'll give you an example. And this isn't even so much of, one of the examples is part of the whole tradition that comes out of Judaism and Christianity and predated both of those to some extent was this idea of original sin, right? That there's somehow something fundamentally flawed in human being, that almost as if the mere fact that you exist, that you're born, is a result of some mistake. And so in Western cultures, you have this rampant disease of unworthiness. And even if someone's not Christian or they're not Jewish, or they've tried to throw it out of their system, they're living in a culture that for the better part of 2,500 years has lived in this mythology of the fall. And that has a profound effect on their consciousness, a very profound effect. And until we can reinterpret what that story was trying to tell us, it's very, very hard to heal that wound of feeling unworthy, The story, I think, can be looked at in a way that doesn't leave us at the end of the day feeling unworthy. But we have to be able to go back and look at it again with fresh eyes.
Right.
Because Jesus didn't go around telling people that they were unworthy, right?
Right.
It's the theologians that went around telling people they're unworthy, but not Jesus. That never entered into any of his dialogues at all, which is another sort of surprising thing when you read through the Gospel.
You say that Zen taught you about the dimension of being far beyond personal psychology. And a lot of people hearing this and reading this won't quite know what it is that you're referring to. How do you describe that dimension that's far beyond personal psychology?
Well, I think it ties into the realizations that a lot of the non-dual traditions are trying to evoke with their teachings and their practices, which is there is a dimension of our experience, of our consciousness, that when it is evoked or when we awaken from it or remember it or have some recognition of it, let's just call it eternity. Not the idea of eternity, but the direct experience of eternity. And when you're experiencing that, you know and you feel that what's eternal within you has no history. It has no time. It has no past. It has no personality. It has no karma. It has no problem. It's the dimension of consciousness, a dimension of human experience that is literally outside of time and everything that touches time. So the non-dual traditions are very, very powerful at evoking that dimension of human experience. That doesn't necessarily solve all the problems of what is in time, of your personality, of your personal psychology, a lot of dimensions of human experience. Some of them spontaneously sort of fall away when you have that transcendent realization, but not all of them. So you can be very deeply rooted in a very transcendent experience of being and still have some very problematic, unresolved issues in your psychology.
Yes.
But that dimension that I would call eternity is a dimension of consciousness that really doesn't have anything to do with our personal psychology because it's transcendent of it.
And you live in that dimension a lot of the time, I assume. And I wanted to ask you, how does it feel to live in that dimension and then have to deal with emotions and conflicts and that kind of thing? Is it ever a struggle? How does that arise for you?
Well, there's really not much struggle. I always, whenever someone asks me a question like that, I always say, for the past 10 years or up to this moment, because I don't know any more than anybody else does what's going to happen tomorrow when I get out of bed, right? It could be different when I get out of bed tomorrow. But the underlying feeling, let's say, the underlying feeling state is, to me, the word I use the most is sort of just contentment. It's sort of just a serene kind of joy that underlies everything. There's still, of course, the human quality of experience, and that's for me, when I got involved in spirituality, I was never in it for a particular experience. It never dawned on me that I wanted to have an X experience. I just wanted to know it was true, what was ultimately true, what was ultimately real. And what I found out was what ended up being ultimately true and ultimately real embraced all the dimensions of my experience. There was the transcendent, but the human side of it, I found that it's one of the things that I appreciate about the Jesus story, because it's a metaphor for one way to address more human parts of our experience, to embrace the frailty, really, of the human experience. It's frail. We can all be taken out at any moment. You never know if someone's going to like you or not like you, or agree with you or disagree with you, or love you or hate you. It's as the Buddha said, there's a lot of impermanence mixed in it. It's frail. You never know what's going to happen. But for me, as the first thing I experienced was sort of that very transcendent, very powerful awakening to eternity. And then over the ensuing years, what really my spirituality became about, without me intending it to do so, was what it was to embrace everything that I had transcended, and to see what's the nature of human emotion and human feeling and personality and everything that can be transcended. And what I found was that the dimension of eternity and the dimension of time and the manifestation were really one and the same. That's one thing to say it or read it, but to experience it brings, at least for me, it brought a very profound healing throughout my humanness, throughout my humanity. It just brought such a sense of healing. And I guess the simplest way to answer your question is that I just feel at ease with it all. I'm at ease with my humanity. I'm at ease with eternity. I'm at ease with life. It doesn't mean everything goes easily. I'm like everybody else. Life has its challenges, but they're just not a big deal. There's just really not. There's an underlying sense of ease and okayness with it all. I don't know if that answers your question, Mark.
Absolutely, it does.
I'm rambling a bit, but
you're not rambling. No, you're absolutely clear. I'm curious to know, what do you find most challenging?
To be quite honest, it's very almost trivial things. The thing I probably find most challenging the most in my life, which will tell you the level of challenge in my life, is my computer. I mean, I'm not joking that, the bigger things of human life, like I named before, people liking you, people not liking you, sickness and people dying and all these things, those aren't big challenges for me anymore. But, I can get frustrated at my computer, and the first thing you'll hear me, kind of yelling through the house is my wife's name, Mukti. Come and save me from this device. I found the devil, and it's a computer. So for me, it's kind of, like that can be at times it can be a frustration to me when it's not, working the way I would like it to work. Strangely enough, when humans don't do the things I might expect them to do, that's not really very frustrating to me. I totally get that. So it's literally like silly little moments like that are really, in the big scheme of things, are very insignificant.
But you don't get angry at people?
No, not really. No, not really. I mean, wait, who knows what happens tomorrow, right? So these are great questions. I'm always hesitant with them, because of the images they might provoke for people of what they imagine my experience is like. But I think the clearest way that I might kind of describe this, which may be a little bit indirect, but it came as a result of what I experienced was certain sort of awakening experiences or realizations, fundamental realizations. But then there was this thing that happened years ago that wasn't really a realization as much it was just something just finally completely fell away. And that's what I term in my terminology self. And to me, self is even more fundamental than ego. Ego is what the self is oftentimes obsessed with. But there was a very sort of distinct experience of this whole self-structure, which is basically the thing that's always looking within, basically. The turn of consciousness that's always sort of looking within and evaluating things. Like I said, when we have the big ego structure in the middle, what it's turning in and seeing almost all the time is the ego. But the whole self-structure just sort of fell away. And the most honest way I can describe that, which sometimes frightens people, but is that I lost my inner world. So what that means is there really isn't much of an experience of an inner world anymore. So the events the events that go through in life don't, for the most part, except when I get frustrated with my computer, but for the most part, they don't evoke an inner life. It's like the events are just the event. Things just happen, and I experience everything that happens, of course, but it doesn't evoke this sort of inner life thing for the most part.
So there's nothing to protect.
Right, there's nothing to protect. Right. And because I can find everything within me. I mean, I can find, what I mean by that is anything that anybody could ever, if they had a criticism, I can just honestly say, sure. Either I can find that, or I have found that, or I absolutely know that's the potential. Because if we really actually are the infinite, not just the idea of the infinite, but we actually experience it, we know that we have infinite potentials and possibilities in all directions, for good and bad, for beauty, for evil, for everything. And I think, in my experience, again, realizing that on a deeply human level, not just a moment of insight, but a very deeply human level, it's left me with really nothing to protect, because there's just nothing, there's not the inner life, there's not the inner story that feels compelled to protect itself.
Beautiful. One last question, if you don't mind. I'm very curious about this idea of divine incarnation, the divine taking human form, and the idea of avatars and such. How do you interpret that?
I think that every single incarnation there is in divine. I know nothing, nor do I even care to know about avatars. I think avatar is an idea, and the idea is separating, because it assumes that there are some divine incarnations as opposed to what and whom. Other people that aren't divine? How could that possibly exist if it's all one? I'm just saying that not necessarily to be a critic of it, because I know people have their own relationship with that, and that's fine. But for me, I hear the ideas of what they're talking about, but I have no reference inside for how any of that could actually possibly be true in me. Because to me, every incarnation, it's divine, because it couldn't be anything else. Some people are connected with that. Some people know that, or they realize that, or they live it and experience it, and some people haven't discovered it. But if somebody hasn't discovered it, it doesn't make them one iota less divine. It doesn't make them one iota less anything. One of my favorite quotes that I use often when I teach was by the Zen master Wang Po. And he said, talking of the one, he said, "It is not more for being manifest in the Buddhas, and not less for being manifest in ordinary sentient beings." And that really corresponds with my experience, and I think a lot of the rest is really a bunch of myth-making, really, that ends up causing separation. Now, some people may be born, they just may come into their incarnation never having really forgotten their true nature. If someone wants to call that person an avatar, fine, well and good. I can understand that. But when we think they have some sort of more essential divinity, I think we're back in the world of separations and dualities and mind-made divisions that aren't really there just because someone is born and maybe they are born in full remembrance of who they are. I would just say, well, good for you, well done, But it doesn't, in my book, it doesn't mean you have more divinity than a heroin addict in the gutter. The heroin addict doesn't know that they're divine. That's the difference. But that's a relative difference. That's not an essential difference. And that's what I love about the Jesus story, is I think that's the part that was kind of, that spoke to me so much, where Jesus wasn't, he got made into an avatar and the God-man and all this stuff after he died, basically by other people. His way of moving in the world was with very ordinary, he picked almost the most ordinary of the kind of people to move amongst that he possibly could, and he was a very outspoken critic of all the various ways that us human beings create divisions and then take advantage of those divisions. And I really have always appreciated that about the story of his life, which is often somewhat different than the theology that gets made out of the story, which is probably the same thing that happens with the Buddha story. It's just human nature, right? Whoever we love, whoever we esteem, whoever we respect, we turn into a god.
We put them on a pedestal.
We put them on a pedestal, yeah, and that may feel good to have your own God and be in relationship with them, and sometimes that's even very healing and maybe even necessary. But ultimately, when we do that, we're basically saying at a deeply unconscious level, you are more than I am. You are other than I am. And at some point, that needs to be disassembled for all of us to fully embrace what we all are. That's why I always say enlightenment doesn't raise you. It actually lowers you, because you see the reality of all beings, not just your being, but all beings. Otherwise it's just an enlightened ego that thinks it's better than and more spiritual or whatever. But to me, the enlightened view is like the ultimate form of democracy. It shows you, hey, we're all ultimately, we're on the same playing field. We are the same stuff. And in that sense, in that absolute sense, we are all of profound equality, which is funny because that's almost the opposite that tends to happen in spirituality. We keep myth-making and making, the things we love into something that's so far beyond us that we can't even hope to ever approach it.
It's absolutely true. Adya, thank you so much. This is just beautiful, and I know that people are going to get a lot out of this piece.
It seemed like we talked for 5 minutes. An hour went by in the snap of a finger, so I had a great time. Yeah.
Thank you, Adya.
You're so welcome, Mark. Take good care.
And you too. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
For more information about Mark's work, join his community at www.markmatousek.com to receive his monthly open book newsletter and learn more about the digital products and autoresponder email courses offered by Mark Matousek Media. To connect with Mark online, visit his site, markmatousek.com, or facebook.com/mark.matousek.